After the explosive rows we have seen unfolding at their conference, it seems appropriate for us to ask whether or not there should be a rise in the minimum wage. Labour members have voted in favour of a £15 per hour minimum wage amid a row over the policy at its conference. The vote is not binding, but comes after MP Andy McDonald resigned from the shadow cabinet, saying he had been ordered to argue against the rise.
Yes, well, we're joined now by Annabel Denham, Director of Communications at the IEA. Thank you very much for joining us, Annabel. Great to have you on board. Do you think that there should be a £15 minimum wage?
Well, no, I don't. And what we're seeing now is precisely what some of my colleagues at the Institute of Economic Affairs forecast, which is the inevitable bidding war that comes as a result of detaching the target for minimum wages from the actual ability to pay. The problem if we increase the minimum wage to £15 an hour is that we'll have one of the highest rates in the world, that if we apply it to all workers, irrespective of age, as the Labour Party is proposing, it will lead to hundreds of thousands of young people, and disproportionately those from ethnic minorities, losing their jobs or failing to find them. The problem we have, and being frank here, is that many of the 13 million people currently employed by 6 million small businesses, those are restaurants, shops, involved in deliveries, childcare, cleaning, they just don't produce enough added value to justify a wage of £15 an hour. Their employers could not pay this rate and stay in business. So what the Labour Party is essentially proposing is mandating a very high minimum wage that businesses wouldn't be able to afford to pay. They wouldn't get the staff, the labour that they need to grow, and would ultimately fold, leading to higher unemployment.
But is there a case, if not £15 minimum wage, because there will be people up and down this country saying, I very much deserve a higher minimum wage for the work I do. Some of the lowest paid jobs are actually some of the hardest. So is there a case to be made for a higher minimum wage?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I think if you look at the evidence, certainly there's a lot that comes from studies over in the US to show that increasing the minimum wage does lead to lower employment. It may not mean that staff are laid off within an existing company, but what it will do is deter hiring. And as I say, that's likely to impact the youngest in society, that's likely to impact those who are the poorest in society, of course, and particularly ethnic minorities. So I think there are real dangers with this renewed enthusiasm for governments trying to raise minimum pay levels. And even if those can sometimes be exaggerated, it's still the case that the national minimum wage is a really poorly targeted way of reducing poverty. Most people who are in poverty are not in work, or they only work part-time. So really what the studies have shown is that increasing the minimum wage tends to benefit not those in poverty, but actually households who are in the middle of the income distribution. A significant proportion, students, partners or spouses of higher earners are well inside the top half of the income distribution, and they're the ones who tend to benefit from these increases. So it's very poorly targeted, and we're not actually helping those who I expect Labour Party politicians really want to.
I think it's potentially a little bit jingoistic, isn't it? But is there any argument to say that it might increase productivity? If you're paid more, are you more likely to work harder, do you think?
Well, no, I mean, I think, as I said at the start, the inverse is true, that there's a real danger of increasing minimum wages when workers are not being productive enough to warrant it. And, over the last decade, we have had this productivity puzzle, and that has led to stagnation in wages, and that's had an impact on people's on the cost of living crisis, on people's disposable incomes, and economists are really struggling to establish exactly why it is that productivity has plateaued over the last 10 years or so. That's why they call it the productivity puzzle. It might be to do with our housing market and the fact that we make it very difficult for people to move to areas that they can be more productive. It might be to do with agglomeration effects, which is linked to the housing market, and that makes it difficult for people to work alongside or in close quarters with other people who are productive, and that can in turn increase innovation innovation and creativity and productivity. We're not quite sure why, but I think until we really, and of course it might be our education system, which is just failing to equip people with the skills that they need for the future workforce. But until we address that, we can't really justify just forcing companies to pay their employees more than they're able to afford.
No, and I don't think we should be afraid to call it out, as I think you rightly did at the start there, really, which is the fact that some people's jobs and some people's productivity is not worth 15 quid an hour. That's just the way it is. Just to move slightly away from this, we are at the moment, I would like your opinion on this, potentially restructuring our economy a little bit. You look at what's going on with the HGV drivers, their salaries increasing, etc. Some people would say maybe this is an element of post-Brexit Britain, where we maybe can restructure our pay structure a little bit, maybe pay more people what they're worth. Do you think that this will just be a temporary thing that's tied just in relation to the fuel crisis or the coronavirus crisis, a quick fix, as it were? Or do you think that we are going to restructure some of our salaries? We're going to see some people in what used to be maybe the lower end of the economic spectrum actually being paid a lot more money now?
Well, I think it's a question of who the we is in your intro there, in your question there, because my view is that if you see wages increasing because there's a shortage of workers, which is exactly what we're seeing with HGV drivers, then that's the market working as it ought to. That's a simple case of supply and demand. And when the supply isn't there and the demand is, then you are going to see an increase in wages, and that ought to attract more people to do their HGV training and work their way through the ranks so that they can become lorry drivers themselves and they can command those higher wages. And then as you have the supply of drivers increasing, then the wages may start to go down again. And that's how things, ought to be working. And that's what benefits consumers and helps avoid situations like the one that we're in at the moment. So I think the risk is that the government is going to step in, and we saw Boris Johnson at the weekend demanding higher pay for lorry drivers, and that's just simply not what the government ought to be doing. It needs to allow businesses who are best equipped to decide what skills and what workers they need to take on to make those decisions, rather than to try and interfere even more than it is at the moment in our labour market. We have reams and reams of employment regulation in the UK labour market at the moment. Determines holiday pay, maternity pay, sick pay. The amount of jobs that require an occupational licence has increased significantly in the last 2 decades. And all of this is making it essentially more difficult for businesses to take on workers, and it's making it more difficult for businesses to pay those workers more. So what I would like to see post-Brexit is the government really sees that opportunity to cut red tape, to unleash businesses and allow them to make the decisions for themselves around hiring and firing. And I think that should lead, in time, to higher wages for those who are being, productive and deserve it.
Absolutely. Annabel, thank you so much. Great to have your insight there. Annabel Denham, who's Director of Communications at the IEA. Some much needed wisdom here on GBNews. I might actually just pack up and become a fruit picker and retire at 35.
Or a diversity and inclusion advisor.
Yeah, I mean...
I might actually do that, look, because it's lucrative, clearly.
Well, very lucrative, absolutely.
I think I'd be a good diversity and inclusion advisor.
Well, I mean, when I was in hospital getting no care whatsoever, it was only the fact that a diversity officer turned up and saved a day that really means that I'm still alive.
I just think I'd provide more common sense than half the diversity and inclusion
Not sure that's what they're after, though, is it?
No, probably not.